Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com discussing extreme climate fraud at government agencies. In yesterday's video, I discussed the Noaa Climate Extremes Index. They claim that the area of the United States experiencing unusually hot summer afternoon temperatures has increased over the last 40 years to a record high. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, over the past decade, more of the United States experienced unusually hot summer afternoons than did during the 1930s. Their data is patently absurd, as was shown in the National Climate Assessment. During the 1930s, heat waves were much longer, they were much more intense, and the highest temperatures were much hotter as well. Most U.S. stations, shown with these blue dots, don't get anywhere near as hot as they did prior to 1960. NOAA's own thermometer data shows that the percentage of the United States getting very hot is much lower than it used to be. The percentage of U.S. stations reaching 90 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the summer has declined quite a bit since 1931. And it's the same story with 95-degree days. In 1931, 93% of the United States reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the summer. This year it's been about 60%. And we see the same trend with 100-degree days. In 1936, 79% of the United States reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the summer. This year it's only been about 30%. The frequency of hot days has also declined sharply since the 1930s. This is the summer percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which has plummeted since 1936. Same story with 95-degree days and with 100-degree days. U.S. summers don't get anywhere near as hot as they used to. And it's important to point out that I'm using almost exactly the same data set which NOAA is using for their Climate Extremes Index, the U.S. Historical Climatology Network. The U.S. Historical Climatology Network consists of 1,218 stations located around the lower 48 states. Now I'm going to explain to you how NOAA corrupts this data set to generate their fraudulent Climate Extremes Index. This graph shows their raw daily temperature data set, which is the actual thermometer measurements they've collected over the last 125 or so years. You can see that summer afternoon temperatures were much hotter during the 1930s and the 1950s, and generally they were warmer prior to 1960 than they've been over the past 60 years. This is daily temperature data. Now let's look at the NOAA monthly temperature data. This graph shows their raw monthly temperature data, which is very similar to the daily temperature data. What they're doing with this data set is that they average the daily temperatures over a month and then publish it as monthly averages rather than daily actual temperatures. Once again, you can see that the 1930s and the 1950s were much hotter and that summer afternoon temperatures were generally much warmer prior to 60 years ago. Now let's look at NOAA's first stage of adjustment. This is NOAA's time of observation bias adjusted data. This data set cools past temperatures somewhat based on the belief that people used to reset their min-max thermometers too close to the afternoon high. According to this theory, this caused double counting of hot days and made temperatures from the 1930s too hot. Whether or not this adjustment is accurate, and I don't want to discuss that in this video, it didn't really change the raw data very much. After adjusting for time of observation bias, the 1930s and 1950s are still much hotter. But now let's look at NOAA's fourth data set, the final adjusted temperature data. This is the data which NOAA generates their graphs from that they release to the public. It shows a strong warming trend over the last 50 years, which doesn't actually exist in the thermometer data. This is the actual thermometer data. There's been no trend in temperatures over the last 50 years. So let's look now how NOAA generates this fake warming over the past 50 years, which they release to the public. This graph shows the difference between the final adjusted temperature and the actual measured thermometer data. The NOAA adjustments have increased summer maximum temperatures in the United States in a hockey stick, which creates almost 2 degrees of warming over the past 50 years that does not exist in the thermometer data. Now I'm going to show you how NOAA creates this fake warming over the past 50 years. There are a total of 1,218 stations in the United States Historical Climatology Network which have been used over the last 125 years. But over the past 30 years, NOAA has been losing these stations very rapidly. The number of stations in use in 1989 was 1,201, but last year it was down to 804. And among these 804 stations, many of them don't report every single month of the year. But whether or not a station still exists, and whether or not that station reports in a particular month, NOAA still generates a monthly temperature in their final data set. Even though more than 400 stations didn't report any thermometer data last year, NOAA still generated data for them. NOAA generates data for 1,218 stations every month, even if that station hasn't existed for decades. Last summer, 42% of the data being used by NOAA in their final data set came from a computer model rather than from a thermometer. As you can see, the amount of fake data being generated by NOAA has greatly increased over the last 30 years. And this graph shows the temperatures of the fake data. Among stations not reporting, NOAA shows about 3 degrees warming over the past 50 years. This is where the NOAA warming trend comes from. It comes from fake data which did not come from actual thermometers. This is pretty spectacular and blatant fraud which NOAA is committing. And if we compare the adjustments being made to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we can see exactly what's going on. NOAA is altering their thermometer data to match global warming theory, rather than altering their theory to match the actual data which doesn't show warming. This is the opposite of how real science is done and is the worst kind of scientific fraud. And NASA is doing exactly the same thing. This was their US temperature graph from 1999. It showed 1934 as the hottest year in the United States and 1998 more than half a degree Celsius cooler. In 1999, NASA showed a strong cooling trend from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century. But NASA has since altered their data. Now they show 1934 cooler than 1998 and a warming trend from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century. NASA's engaged in exactly the same fraud as NOAA, and their motivation for doing so is also the same. Tens of billions of dollars are being pushed into the global warming scam. The people behind it want to control the U.S. energy supply, and they're doing this by demonizing fossil fuels. They don't like me exposing their fraud, so they write a lot of hit pieces about me. This one was from Climate Nexus this week. They say that I'm banned, exposed, and corrupt, and a conspiracy theorist. They say that I'm peddling dangerous disinformation. What I've done here today, and what I do almost every other day, is acted as a climate crime scene investigator. I've detailed fraud by government agencies using their own data. This is what crime scene investigators do. They look at evidence to find out how the crime was committed and who committed it. Most crimes are by definition a conspiracy. Imagine a defense attorney trying to get the case dismissed based on the claim that the crime scene investigation was conspiracy theory. The judge probably wouldn't be very happy with them. Yet this claim of conspiracy theory is exactly the defense which climate criminals have used to cover up their crimes. Almost all criminal prosecutions are based on conspiracy theory. In a courtroom, it's up to the defense to convince the jury that the prosecutor's theory is incorrect. But they don't make any attempt to prove that I'm incorrect. Instead, they simply slander me and call me a conspiracy theorist. It's been this way for Toto for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.